All right, guys, welcome. Thanks to everyone that's
So,
joining.
how many have we got online now?
So far we've got 36 attendees and it's going up every second. So I'm expecting everyone will kind of jump on as they jump on.
Cool.
But I think
All
we'll probably just get going because there's a lot to go through in an hour and I want to make sure we can get through all the questions as well. So
Yep.
Jala, do you want to kick things off?
Yeah, cool. So my name's Jala. I'm the community manager at The Generator, which is Monash's entrepreneurial hub. This is the first time we've ever done a webinar of this type. So yeah, it's really exciting. Thank you so much for joining us. So we're going to be talking about the building blocks of a startup today. And James is our facilitator. So James is the co-founder and partner at Galileo Ventures, a new venture seed capital fund and accelerator. He's also the co-founder and program manager of Incubate, which is the Uni of Sydney's equivalent of The Generator. In fact, in 2015-16, in the summer, The Generator actually started with a pilot program from Incubate. So there's a nice connection there. So yeah, we owe a lot to James and what he's created. So James is going to present for about 45 minutes to an hour. And like he said before, make sure you have the chat bar open so that you can ask questions throughout. And James will be doing a few polls as well. So that's going to be really cool. And then after the formal presentation, we'll open up the floor for a bit of a Q&A. So we're also going to be recording today's presentation, so you can jump back in at any time in the future. Yeah, that's me. I'll hand it over to you, James.
Great. Thanks, Jala. It's fantastic to be hosting this. This is my first webinar actually as part of since the lockdown with so many people. So we've had over 160 people register. We've got 55 and ticking up now. So for all the 50 plus people watching, thanks very much for tuning in. Hopefully this is going to be a lot of fun, and hopefully I'll tell you some new information you haven't heard before. And hopefully you'll be able to go and utilize some of this information. If I do break up and I can't tell, because sometimes the host can't tell, please do just chuck it in chat to say that you missed it or you didn't quite hear it. If you get disconnected at all, you can jump back on anytime. We're recording all of this, so there'll actually be a very nice high quality recording that I'll post up later, so you can always rewatch this as well. And I'll share the slides with you too after this. So don't worry if you miss something on the slides, we'll totally get it. You'll be able to see it later on. All right. So as before mentioned, if you don't know what the Monash generator is, you can check it out here on these details. I'm guessing most of you came from there, and I already know from Eventbrite that a lot of you are from Monash, which is good. For those of you who have no idea what Monash generator is, it's essentially their accelerator program. Jala, do you want to jump in and just maybe give a bit of a spiel?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is us on social. That's where you can find us. So it's a really good way of keeping up to date with everything that we're up to. And you can reach out to us at any time on the entrepreneurship email address or on the website. We are here for you at any time, any stage of your entrepreneurial journey. So yeah, that's us. I think the next slide is the
I'll go next slide.
Yeah, so because this is the first time we've ever run anything like this, we would love your feedback on how we can do better next time. So I'll send that around in the next day or so. But yeah, we'd really love your feedback and appreciate it.
Great, thanks so much.
That's it.
Okay. All right, so in case you didn't read the blurb or you want a refresher, we're going to cover a few things today. The main three things I want to get through is essentially conversations with customers. So this is talking to customers. Often it's talking to customers for the first time. We'll talk a little bit about prototyping In specifically, prototyping you can do without any money, or at least not spending much money. And then we'll talk a little about proof. And what I mean by proof is sort of validation that you have something substantial, that there is something interesting that you're pursuing. I'll keep a lookout for the webinar chat. I should be able to see people if the people do chat. And I think there is a Q&A open as well. So you can submit a question, I believe, on Zoom. If there's any issues going along, please feel free to reach out to Jalal, who's also monitoring as well, or send me a private chat too. I should get that. But this is the first time we're running things. So if something goes wrong, apologies in advance. But I think we'll get through this pretty easily. Okay, I'll just go through and then we will get into it. So as I mentioned before, let's get interactive. You can ask a question, I believe, and you can also upvote questions that get asked. So we don't have to answer every single question. I've got a couple of polls that I will also do, that I'll attempt to do. I've never done a live poll in Zoom before, so let's find out if this works. And potentially, if some of you want to chat about something, we can see about promoting some of you to a panelist, which means you can actually jump on and also chat. So when I sort of sat down to do these slides, I wanted to give everyone a bit of a introduction to kind of the context of me presenting this information. And this is really more so from a context of having helped lots of different founders over the years. I'll talk a little about my background in a second. But the thing I've noticed is essentially new businesses at their core are very creative endeavors. It might not seem like that on the surface because I think a lot of people equate business with very big established things. But in reality, from a startup perspective, they're very, very creative. I've observed there's some key fundamentals that remain constant, especially in the first 6 to 12 months of building a startup. And so these building blocks are essentially the genesis and inspiration for today. So hopefully for today, you'll get an understanding of why conversation with customers is important and some tips about how to go about that. We'll talk about some basics of creating lo-fi prototypes. We'll also get an understanding of how to demonstrate traction without needing to raise money. And then I'll also talk a little about Galileo at the end, so you get a sense of that and what's happening there. All right, let's jump into our first poll. Let's see if this will work. It might not work. All right, so the first poll is launch poll. Okay, it is, there we go. It is, what is your main motivation behind wanting to launch a startup? You can only select one. I know a lot of you probably have like 3 or 4 or maybe all of them, but sort of just give me a sense of what your main motivation is. There is no right or wrong answer here. I'm just intrigued to see what people are thinking right now. And see, yeah, feel free to take your time. We've got 1 vote. If you can't see where the poll is, it should be in your panel. It should be in the panel somewhere of your Zoom window. Let me just move that. Oh, we got some attendees. Cool. I'm just going to give a quick check, see if you can get the poll. Michelle, I'm going to allow you to talk for a second. So I'm just going to chuck you on because you raised your hand. All right, Michelle, you are allowed to talk.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you.
Hello. How's it going?
Yeah, it's going good, working from home.
That's good. That's great. And what brings you here today?
Well, I've got an idea for a startup that will connect people socially because I think, especially with modern times, people are really lonely, but they don't know how to make new friends when they get into their 20s and 30s and beyond. So I want to solve that problem.
Sure, gotcha. What I might do is I might loop back later on. So we're going to start talking about a few things, and then we might loop back and get you to kind of present it and pitch it at the end, if that's all right.
Cool.
Cool, no problem. Thank you. All right. That worked. Oops, sorry. All right. Okay, so some of your polls are coming in. Please do keep them coming in if you can. So you've got 3 people have voted so far. Oh, let me check my chat. Yes, you can't see the poll anywhere. So it should be available on your window. If you go to your chat window, there should be a Q&A and there should be a polling. This is good. This is good tips for next time. I'm gonna have to get some instructions for some of these things later. But it should be there. Oh, okay. It might not be enabled for some of you. Well, look, we'll keep going, I think, because it says all of you should be able to access it, which is unfortunate that you can't. Let me just quick check. No problem. All right. We will continue on. And 4 of you have managed to vote. Yeah, if it's not working in your browser, it might be because you need the downloaded app. But let's just continue on. So the poll was, what was your main motivation? And I'll sort of run through the poll for everyone. So for those that can't see the questions. And it was the main motivations, choices you had are sitting on a burning idea, seeing an opportunity, financial freedom, being your own boss, or wanting to solve a problem, or invented something new, or undecided, you're just exploring. There we go. There's a few of you now voting. So I think some of you have started to find it. I'm not sure if it's not showing up for some of you. Maybe there's some compatibility with some of the apps. But for quite a lot of you, wanting to solve a problem seems to be, for the 6 of you at least, wanting to solve a problem is there. What I'll do is I'll keep on going and I might come back to it. Yeah, that's weird. That's interesting. If you can only see chat, raise hand, and Q&A. Well, I'll tell you what, if you can only see that, then feel free to submit a question on Q&A and we can keep on going. And then we'll just keep on going with the presentation for now. For those of you who can see the poll, that's fine. Maybe it's just a compatibility version. Okay, cool. So a little bit about me, so you get some context. As Charlotte mentioned before, I started a program called Incubate, which was the University of Sydney's accelerator program. I ran that for about 7 years and recently stepped out of that. And that program was all around helping entrepreneurs leaving university. You know, it started off really student heavy, but then it ended up being a mixture of students, alumni, researchers as well. The main thing about that is I kind of, over those years, we directly helped about 120 startups come through our accelerator program, plus we had a pre-accelerator program. So I got to see a lot of the mistakes startups made, but I also got to see quite a lot of the things that startups were able to succeed in, and got to see some of the successful founders too, and what made them successful. Prior to that, I was actually been working in startups since 2009. Atlassian was my first place I worked at, which was really interesting. So that was a cool experience. I founded Galileo Ventures with a co-founder of mine in 2018, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. And then I've also been teaching and doing a masterclass series for entrepreneur support organizations, which I'll also mention later on as well. If you're wondering, my background is actually sort of more technical. So I did a computer science background, but these days I don't really code that much. I leave that up to, very good software engineers. I was never a very good coder, to be honest. But I do love technology and all things technology. Yeah. So unfortunately, for those of you who can't see the poll option, that's unfortunate. So the phone apparently has the poll up function. So if you open the phone app, but don't worry too much. We'll just keep on going. There's no biggie if you can't vote. We'll just keep on going with the presentation. For those of you that are interesting, the 11% of you that do access the polling function, most of you are doing a startup because you want to solve a problem, which is really good to hear. Okay, let me just take the time. So a quick thoughts of startups. I'm not going to spend too long on this because I want to get into the meat of it. But one of the things I noticed is that startups are essentially a unique business. So every startup is unique. In that respect, sort of n equals 1. There is no one that will ever do a startup like the one you are all trying to do. However, the problems are unique that are not unique, right? So in a sense, that problems scale. The actual startup business itself is unique because it's unique by the very fact that it's made up of people, and everyone has a different way of doing something. Obviously, you need to be able to understand the core problem and the customer. And so the working definition for me is that startups are about bringing new ideas to market to solve problems, utilizing technology with the potential to grow large. Now, I'm sure some of you might be working on all sorts of types of businesses here. So a lot of what I'll say doesn't necessarily have to apply to technology businesses. But when I do mention startups, a lot of the time, I'm going to refer to startups that are businesses that can potentially grow very big. But this equally applies if you're starting a small business too. Yeah, I think we'll just use the Q&A chat, July. I totally agree. And we'll go from there. All right. I'm going to skip this slide. So there's any slides where there's got extra on it, I'm going to leave that for you guys to think about later on and you can read over. We might come back to it at the end if we have time. So I will stop on this one. This is an interesting slide from Airtree Ventures, and it's just more about the Australian context, right? So a lot of people kind of go, you know, it's very hard to start big businesses in Australia. Historically, that might have been true, but that's changed in the last sort of decade or so. And what we've seen is we've seen a lot of businesses founded that have become very big businesses, at least from a valuation perspective. And so what you can see here, and I'll just put my cursor on. And so what you should be able to see here is that, in sort of the 1990s, we had the first kind of wave, and you had WiseTech and MYOB, and those businesses are still around. 2000s, we kind of started getting the second wave, and then from 2000 to 2010, we had sort of the first wave of technology companies that are now quite infamous, you know, including Atlassian and Envato if you're in Melbourne, Xero, obviously, from New Zealand. And then subsequently, we've had more and more companies come up from 2010 to 2020 plus, right? So the point here is that if you're a founder that's getting going, there is a lot more capital, more than ever before, even though we are approaching this crunch time in the next 6 months, and happy to talk about that at some point. The other component is we're in good company. So there's now a lot more experience in the ecosystem as well. So there's a huge amount of momentum. So it's a great time to be an entrepreneur in the Australian context. I do like this quote from Stephen Hawking, so I thought I'd throw it in there, which is try to make sense of the things you see, what makes the universe exist. Obviously, he's talking from a broadest perspective, but this applies to entrepreneurs as well. Be curious, and however difficult it might seem, there's always something you can do and succeed at, and matters that you just don't give up, which is absolutely true. All right, let's jump into the first section, which is conversations. I am keeping a lookout on this chat and the Q&A, so feel free to send through any questions on that. Okay, so the first thing is conversations, and the subtitle is don't be selfish. And I'm going to talk about what I mean by this. So conversations, often called customer development, is a lot around understanding a customer, right? However, I've called it conversations because I've noticed that it's a lot more informal than what design thinking books would like to make them out to be. And the reason I sort of subtitle it "Don't be selfish" is a common mistake I see in founders is becoming a little too precious about their idea. And the reason that is because a startup is actually not really about building your idea. It's about solving problems for other people. The way I like to split it up is that I've observed that there's sometimes very founder-centric startups, which is typically more about personality and ego than doing anything meaningful. And there's quite a lot of those around. And then there's problem-centric startups, which are far more about solving a specific problem that someone cares about. So, AKA share the love of solving things, right? And these are two very sad, one very sad baby, one very happy baby here. The other way to understand this is to understand people's problems. Obviously, you need to talk to them. If it's not about your problem, it's about other people's problems, then you need to understand that. But the founder also needs to have a sense of a direction, right? A vision. Obviously, this is actually quite the tricky part because it's kind of balancing what you want to achieve, your vision, with what you can achieve now and making those little steps to make meaningful progress. But of course, what should those little steps be? That's the tricky part, right? So when we dive into step one, which is conversations with the customers, it's more a conversation than customer interview. it's about getting comfortable with approaching strangers. You don't need to know if they'll be your customer, but you do need to know if they have problems. And typically what I kind of advise is if you've never done this before, then to create a set of 10 questions and just get going. And one of the things you'll sort of discover as you get going is the first conversations are always very difficult, but it gets better. Once you've worked out how to get in the door, talking about problems is actually quite fun, because you end up having to see the positive responses from them when they sort of want you to solve their problems. Let me just go across here and end this poll, and let me check the Q&A. Great. Okay. So what we'll do is, if people can see the Q&A functionality, feel free to type a question, especially if it's on anything I'm sort of mentioning here, or type it into the chat if you can't access the Q&A function as well. Feel free to type in the chat, and I'll try and keep this as interactive as possible with any questions. So it's not just me talking, sort of, and I get a sense of kind of the vibe in the room too, in the virtual room, that is. An important thing with sort of conversations with customers in the very beginning is that you're actually not selling anything. And this is sometimes something that's hard to resist, or something that people get wrong in the very beginning, which is you're actually not selling, you're just trying to get them to do the talking. And let's go into that a bit more. Now, I did have another poll with customers, but I'm going to skip this poll just because a lot of you can't access the poll functionality. And I'll let anyone ask questions about sort of any problems they've had around talking with customers. So a rule I like to tell the founders that I've sort of helped over the years through the Accelerator program is the 15-minute rule. And what is that? What I mean by that is, if you can get a stranger to talk for more than 15 minutes about the problem that they're experiencing, there's a good chance that they'll pay something for a solution. Now, if you kind of go out on your own to talk to customers for the first time, and you are finding it really hard to get people to talk about their problems, then it becomes a real question about, you know, how much do they really care about this problem, and whether they actually give you any money to solve it. You'll often find that when you do touch on a chord, so a problem that people experience, is that you'll find that getting them to talk for more than an hour is pretty easy once they get going. And I'm sure some of you here have had that experience where you sort of go out there, ask a customer about the problems they're experiencing, and just have them sort of talk and talk and talk. Cool. I'm going to switch across to the first question. Let's see how this works. Answer live. Okay, so the first question I've got here is, should we keep contact with these customers so that when we do need them, we can contact them? If so, how should we do it? So I think the question is around when you do reach out to people to talk to them and ask them about their problems. So the very first iterations you do this is like, how should you keep up with them? Keep in touch with them. So I would recommend a couple of things. The first thing is, put them, if they are genuinely interested and excited about what you're doing, or preferably if they actually have the problem that you're trying to solve, put them on a newsletter if they agree. So you can ask them if they'd like to stay updated with what's happening in the company. Or if you're too early for that, just make a note of it in a spreadsheet somewhere. So you can always look back on everyone you've spoken to. And there's a couple of tips here as well, I'd say, which is anyone you've spoken to who you get a good, who you have a good rapport with, or a good vibe with, if you like, those are potential people that might very well be your first customer. And so a lot of founders I've spoken to kind of don't understand the second benefit of this, which is when you do go out and talk to customers for the very first time, before you've got anything ready, often these people can become some of your first customers, or some of the people that will give you the first amount of experience. Cool. All right, done. Cool. I'll let you keep typing questions. You can upvote questions, by the way. So feel free to chuck as many questions as you want. We don't have to get necessarily to all of them. I'll do the ones that are there, or the ones that have the most votes as we get along. Okay, let's keep on going. So some examples, and I'm going to try and put some concrete examples in every single thing we're talking about here, so it's not too abstract. But these are some really good questions if you're really struggling to kind of know what to ask them in the first instance. The first one is, how do you currently solve, let me move this window. How do you currently solve this problem today? And that's probably the most basic one, right? So if you think about it, you're out there trying to sell this product to someone. You think they've got this problem, but in reality, they probably have a way to solve this problem right now, right? And it might be a big workaround, it might be a lot of effort, but you want to know. And a good example of that is typically when I see a lot of startups that are building enterprise tools, so software tools or web tools for businesses. You know, often your competition isn't other startups. Your competition is Microsoft Excel, right? And that's because so much of businesses is just run on Excel spreadsheets. And in fact, if you kind of look at all the top large enterprise companies that have popped up in the last 5 years, a lot of them are just simply replacing Excel functionality with something that's a lot more intuitive and a lot more powerful. Okay, and the second question that is really good to ask them is, what else is affected by this problem, and how, and such as time or resourcing. And what I mean by that is, what are the constraints, right? And so if we kind of go back to this example of, oh, you're building a widget for, let's say, a big business to be able to track something inside their business, why do they have such a big problem tracking these things, these items? And I'll give you a real life example of a startup I've helped as well. I helped a startup that was giving pricing data to big retail. And so what I mean by that is, if you think of a Coles or a Woolworths, you know, which are kind of going gangbusters right now, they've got thousands of items on a shelf every single day. Every single one of those prices are dynamic. And what I mean by dynamic is they can change every day. Sometimes they can change every hour, and they definitely change every week. And so as a business, one of the constraints you have is going, how do we find out what all the pricing is for everyone else? And what they used to do is they used to hire teams of people to go solve this problem. And so one of the constraints they actually have is how many staff they have that can manually go check all the pricing in all their competitors. Now, as time's gone on, they've started to use the internet more. They've started to get this data from other areas, but it's still very much a mixed manual process. And it's a really interesting thing when you dive in and ask anyone that's in pricing about this problem. They'll just go on for ages about it. Interestingly, Amazon is actually fantastic at this. Amazon's built an entire suite of tools which allows Amazon to track pricing dynamically for a bunch of people. But we won't go too much, but that's just one example. The third point here, which is what frustrates or motivates your customers, is a really big one. You know, you want to kind of understand anything that's full of emotion, but more importantly, what do they really get frustrated about? Because sometimes when people tell you this is the problem that they have, it's actually not the problem that they have. And that's kind of a weird thing to say, but it is something that comes out of user interviews. If you talk to anyone that's a really experienced customer interview person or user experience designer, you know, often you need to kind of get a sense of what do they actually mean behind what they're telling you, right? Because people expressing themselves is sometimes not very clear, especially in the context of your customers. So understanding what frustrates and motivates can be a way around that. The fourth point here is, how do your customers make decisions? This is a really important one. So this is kind of, once you've identified that they have this problem, how do they end up going, I am going to buy this thing to solve this problem, right? Who needs to be on that decision, and who else has to be there? And I see there's some questions coming through, which is cool. So I'll get through those questions in a second. And pro tip, at the very end of any conversation you have with a customer, it doesn't matter if it's a formal interview or if you just run into someone on the street or if you're in a cafe or whatever it might be, although these days you won't be in a cafe. So it probably will be always something you reach out to them. Always add, is there anything else I should have known about or should have asked? And the reason you should add that is you'd be amazed that the amount of extra information a customer might tell you when you give them the opportunity. And it's more so from the perspective of that, as a founder, you're very focused on solving a particular thing. But from a customer perspective, actually, you might be missing the bigger picture or the bigger pain point. And by letting them kind of talk a bit more broadly, sometimes you might get a glimpse of this and you might see a much bigger opportunity. There's been lots of interesting cases I've had where people talk about some of the interesting problems. In the slides, you'll see that there's a resource section here at the very bottom. Those are hyperlinks to blog posts or articles. So when we do send you the slides, you'll be able to click on them and check out some more information about these dot points. Yes, I'm just seeing what you said there. Okay, let's switch to some questions here and what some of you are saying. Yes, that's right, Jalal. Super simple landing page is a really great way to launch and save your customers subscribe to newsletters. If you don't have a newsletter set up, set one up on MailChimp. It's very easy. There's a whole bunch of free newsletter services out there now. Just any way they can collect your details. Even a Google form is free, right? Just get something so you can collect the details. Always try and collect details, especially if someone is interested in what you're doing, right? It's just an easy way. Okay, I'm going to go to the first question, which is Beck's question, because you've had quite a lot of responses. So I'm going to answer this one live, which the question is for everyone, any tips on documenting customer responses? We have found that customer responses are unique and don't boil down to a simple yes, no answers. As a scientist who loves to graph, tabulate things, this is a bit of a pain point. Yeah, I totally understand. I totally hear you. Okay, so there's two answers to this. The first answer is you can try and get qualitative data out of your customers as much as you like. But the reality is in the very beginning with a lot of these problem questions, it's what you're after is actually more qualitative responses. So things that are emotional, things that frustrate them, and things that motivate them. And the reason that is because you want to get a sense of the attributes of the problem, both from a how should we design this solution, so like a product experience perspective, but also from a sales perspective. And what I mean from a sales perspective is if you know the thing that absolutely frustrates your customers, you can pick up a phone, call them out of the blue. They won't know who you are, but you'll be able to start getting them talking about the problem straight away, because you can literally start with, I know you have this problem and I know it's extremely annoying. And they'll be like, they don't care who you are. They'll want to know why you know this problem. They'll want to know how you can solve it. And so some of it's from a sales perspective, but some of it's also from a product design perspective. In terms of how to document that, I would really recommend, again, keeping a spreadsheet of answers or somewhere where you're making the notes so you can look back and reflect on them. And you can start to so what you can start to do is look for the trends in the qualitative feedback. And let me just think of an example here. So if you think about it from, let's say your business is selling, I'll go back to my enterprise example here. Let's say your business is trying to sell to other businesses, right? And you're having a lot of qualitative interviews and they're giving you all sorts of responses which are all over the place. If you've only spoken to 10 customers, you're probably going to get a lot of variation. As you kind of get your number up in terms of your customer interviews, you'll start to see some trends and some patterns. And those are the things that you can start to focus in on. In particular, one of the behavioral patterns you want to start looking for, as an example, is what do they do just before they're trying to solve this problem that you're solving? So what is the action beforehand? Sometimes it's they're searching for a response, or sometimes they're searching for an answer. And in some cases, you can actually ask them, what are the search terms you use? The other thing you can do, absolutely, that's a good one. Ellie from there, so Likert scale, satisfaction, happiness scale. You can use those things. I would probably, if you kind of think of it from a practical perspective, I'd probably limit your quantitative questions to only a few questions in the very beginning, and just make sure they're answering the main questions about, for example, how do they currently solve this problem today, right? So it's not really their job, your customer's job, to give you quantitative data at this stage. You just need to get a sense of the problem that they have and how they're experiencing this. Once you've kind of gotten that validation that there is a problem, that's kind of when you can go to the next level, which is, okay, let's actually talk about what are the tools you're using, right? So are you using these tools? What are the things you're doing? How satisfied are you with these tools? It is a lot of messy work in the very beginning, but unfortunately that is it. So I hope that answers some of that question there, Beck, as well. And thanks, Ellie, for jumping in. Cool. All right, let's keep going. I'm probably going to go way over time here, so I'm going to try and keep everyone. Oh, yep, let's keep going. So these are some tips from some of our other founders over the years. If you're doing this for the first time, or if you've already been through a first cycle of customer interviews, these are things to keep in mind. So you want to adopt as beginner's mindset. You want to ask broad, open-ended questions. You want to disarm politeness and separate behavior from feedback. So looking for patterns, not necessarily desires. And what I mean by that is you don't want to build the faster horse. You want to build the solution that they actually use. The other thing I wanted to touch on is finding customers to talk to. So just understanding where do you go out and find them, because this is the other part. So if you haven't spoken to customers at all, I would recommend coming up with 10 simple questions to ask them, and then just going out and finding them and asking them. If you have spoken to them, then you kind of got to refine those questions or perhaps expand them based on other information that you don't know. In terms of where you can find them, I like to use the analogy of a pond. So where do you go to find goldfish? Well, you go to a pond, right? Because the goldfish are ponds. The same analogy, right? And so the tricky thing for you as a founder is just to work out what are the ponds in your industry. So where do they hang out? So typically this could be social media groups like FB groups or LinkedIn. Sometimes it's social media networks like Instagram profiles or Instagram followers on profiles, online forums, conferences, and trade shows. Those are the sort of broad ones. I won't talk too much about those, but we can go into, I can talk about that if anyone's got any specific questions. I'm going to skip over this part so you can check it out yourselves, just because I want to, in the interest of time, I want to make sure I touch on the other stuff. But this is just talking about cold calling, and I've got an example script here and some other stuff to think about. So we can talk, you can have a look at those later on. Prototyping. So let's just talk about it. So the subtitle here is wastage is the key to efficiency. And I really like that subtitle because I think with prototyping, a lot of it is about experimentation. So what do I mean by that? So one of the things I look for when we're talking to founders is founders that bias towards action and experimentation. That means trying lots of things that won't work, as well as discovering things that do. Successful startups I've observed have a very high volume and high pace of experimentation. And we'll talk about a few ways you can do experimentation. So a key question you might sort of find yourself is debating, and this has happened with me, and this has happened with a lot of other startups, is sort of debating an idea internally rather than just trying something with customers. And so, you know, a classic one might be spending far too long debating about a logo or a brand name. But in reality, maybe what you should do is just go out and pick up the phone and talk to a few customers, right? And so back to this whole thing about should you keep a record of the people you're speaking to? Yes, absolutely. If they're happy to talk again, then this is a great time when you can simply just give them a call and go, hey, you know, we're thinking of these things, you know, we'd love just some quick feedback. It's important to remember that although it kind of sounds intuitive, it is one of the biggest advantages you have as a startup over established business, which is you can just try things really fast and are really lean, right? It doesn't have to be formal. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to go through 10 different ethics reviews, at least not for most startups. And it can be something you just go out there and try. And this is your advantage over almost all the other types of businesses out there that are in your industry. The goal with prototyping, as well as when you do a customer interviewing, is you kind of got to get to this nexus of what do customers want, what will they pay for, and what can you build, right? And this is tricky, right? Because a lot of people might not necessarily be in this sort of what we can build part. It might be very nebulous because they don't have the resourcing, or you might be a technical founder and in fact the build part's really easy. But then you kind of need to go, well, what do customers want here? And then obviously the question is what will they pay for? Now, what do customers want and what will they pay for is actually two areas that everyone can go out and do for free just by speaking to people, right? And obviously, if you've never done it before, it needs a few iterations for you to sort of get comfortable with it. The what we can build part, you can also define, but you might not be able to do yourself depending on kind of your background, your skills and resources. But at least we can kind of define that area. I'm going to go through a couple of examples, but I'll answer a question first. So let's go to Prisha's question. He's got 4 upvotes, and I'll answer that one live. Okay, so the question is, how do I find human capital resources that I need for my startup if I've yet to have the funds to pay for those resources? And without the resources, my startup is likely not to make, I'm guessing, any traction. So, Brisa, I'm actually going to talk about traction later on, but to quickly answer your question, one of the key areas for a founder is understanding, A, what are the resources I need? And then B, going out there and being able to find and recruit them yourself. So I think the first question is sort of being able to define exactly what those resources are. And then the second question is, okay, what do we actually need to prove out to be able to get to the next stage, right? And so if you don't have the money to pay for those resources, what are some alternatives of what you can do to be able to show that people actually want to use this service? Or people can pay for this service in some way to fund the resourcing, right? Now, a lot of the time, I think a lot of people just sort of jump to investment because it seems like really obvious, and it seems that there's these startup investors everywhere now, and surely they're going to invest money. But the reality is, I think when it comes to investment, is that it can be a lot harder to get, and the bar is a lot higher these days. And what I mean by that is, the progress you have to make before someone invests has become a lot higher. And the reason that is because the quality of the startups have gotten higher as well. So what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the later slides. But if we don't answer that, feel free to ask me more questions at the end as well. So I'm going to talk about some examples of prototypes you can run with no capital and with just free tools online. And so the first example is, and I love this one, is the sign up page for Buffer. Buffer was a social media service. And this is something that they wanted to test. So this is, if you kind of think back, this is quite a few years ago when Twitter was really just starting to get big. And they were like, well, maybe people have a problem with managing when they tweet or when they should be tweeting, right? Now, rather than build an entire tool, what the Buffer founders did is essentially built a landing page, and we sort of mentioned that before. And then they put a plans and pricing button here. So as you can see here, this is the landing page. It's very simple. It was just choose a time to tweet, add tweets to Buffer, and Buffer does the rest. And then you've got plans and pricing. People would click on that. It would get to this page, which had the 3 tiers of pricing, right, which you've all seen before now. And then people had with this message, which is, hello, you've caught us before you're ready. And so what they were actually testing here was more so, does anyone even click on plans and pricing? When they do click on plans and pricing, do they even click on the amount? So they do want free? Are they going to pay a little bit of money? Or are they going to pay a lot of money? And then they weren't taking any money, but they had the option for you to put your email in to say, hey, I'm interested, right? And so this is a really interesting example of just capturing buying intent without actually taking any money per se, right? So not taking money. And so with this, they essentially tweeted this out. They had enough traction and enough people sign up to give them the confidence that they should go ahead and actually build something. And they also had a list of customers that were interested to go from here. So I'll keep going, and I noticed some questions here, which is good. And feel free to keep adding to some of the answers as well. So that's one. So that's what I'll call that a sign-up page, right? Or a early sign-up page. Now, of course, that works really well for web and mobile applications, but it can also work really well for physical-based products, right? So anywhere hardware-based products. The trick is with these things is you've got to be able to get this information out to a lot of people. And so sometimes that could be through a newsletter, or sometimes that could be through someone who's an industry influencer, or sometimes it's simple as just paying for ads on Facebook for your product and just seeing how many people click on your product, right? And so that's, again, it's just testing intent, buying intent without actually taking the money. The other prototyping tool, which is really strong, and you can use this in a lot of ways, is clickable prototypes. Some of you might have had some experience with this, but there are actually quite a lot of ways to do this. And clickable prototypes through Keynote is a fantastic thing. There are a couple of applications that allow you to create some really awesome clickable prototypes in Keynote. And what I mean by clickable prototypes is if you're building a web or a mobile website or a mobile application or web application, you can actually design up all your screens in Keynote and present that presentation to someone, let's say a potential user, and they can click around on your app as if it was working, and it would literally feel to them like a working product. But obviously to you, it's not a working product. You're sort of testing the usability and the functionality component. It works really well for web and mobile. I've got a resource here, which is the Google Ventures Design Sprint, where they sort of popularized this method a lot because they did this with a lot of startups in Silicon Valley. And we've adapted this method as well. I've used this method with Incubate startups before, and it's been really good for getting some quick results. And this is some examples of some of these screens, right? So this looks like a very polished web page. This looks like a very polished iPad app. None of that stuff is real. It's all just a prototype. It's clickable, it's interactable, and anyone can do it without knowing any code, right? And so that's a really good example. If you have a look at the Google's Ventures Design Sprint blog post on this, they'll give you a link of resources as well for this stuff. And so you can actually use some of these tools. Another one of these clickable prototype applications is called InVision. So that's Vision. And InVision is also quite a popularized tool now, but it's a bit more advanced, if you like. So a lot of designers use that tool. All right, I might just switch across to some questions. We've got some chat. Figma is another really cool website. Yeah, I haven't heard of Figma, so thanks for that. The other one is Balsamiq, which is kind of a really old school clickable prototype one. It used to be free. I think they're trying to charge money now. Cool. Let's see. All right. What I'll do is I'll come back to that question there after we've just got through the prototypes, because we'll cover that in a second. Okay, concierge prototype, sometimes called Wizard of Oz. I'm not too sure how many of you have seen the Wizard of Oz film, but a concierge prototype is, again, presenting the idea that you've got a working front end of your business, but in the behind the scenes, you're actually doing everything manually, right? So I'll give you an example of a startup I worked with, which was a home cooked meals startup. So it was taking the premise that there's a lot of home cooked meals going on. There's a lot of what we call home chefs, so people that cook meals often in the suburbs, right? And these are specialty meals, often from very specific geographies and specific types of cuisine. And of course, the question was around how do we kind of get this stuff out there? And so what they did is they essentially created a online WordPress page, which had an order functionality. It was like as if it was a marketplace. They filled up the marketplace with chef data. So they actually went to some of the home chefs and they manually collected the data from them. They put it on there. They got their permission to put it on there, and they took their orders in, but they manually called up the chefs in the background. They manually delivered it themselves, right? And so what they were actually testing here was, would people even buy from home cooked chefs? And how would that even work from a sort of experience perspective, and what do people expect? It was a really interesting test, and it actually worked out quite well for them as well. All right, let's keep on going. The other one is a proof of concept prototype. And a proof of concept prototype is essentially really good with complicated physical products. So some of you might have very complicated products that you want to build. But the key here is working out what functionality and components can be shown to work in some sort of reduced form. And I'll give you an example here of one of the startups I've helped before. This is a startup that is building essentially what we call a flying taxi. So you jump in the taxi and it will take you to different areas. The area it's called, this sort of industry is inter-CBD travel or short form travel. So traveling between cities that are close by or cities or in between really big cities. But of course, building a flying taxi is extremely complicated. No one's going to give you the money. Very few people have the money to do it themselves. So what do, right? So the key thing here is to remember that typically hardware-based businesses are funded by completing certain stages and proving out that you have made traction on this point before you can kind of get to the next stage. The key thing for your business, right, because I'm giving you some general advice, is you need to work out what are the steps that you need to prove to get to that next stage, whether that stage is a funding or whether that's getting a customer to sign up. So in this case, the first thing here Andrew did, who's the founder, Andrew Moore, is he had to prove out that the concept would work with his type of design, right? And so what they made is this little thing here, which is essentially just a scaled model. Now this scaled model flies, and importantly, it flies with the mechanism that they need to show to work for this type of aircraft. And that type of aircraft is what we call vertical takeoff. And so what it means is it takes off like a helicopter, but it flies like a plane, right? And he had to show that that mechanism could work. Then they kind of went to the next stage. So they could show that that mechanism would work, and they managed to get their first contract with this proof point. That first contract was then funding for this stage, which was not a full-size prototype, but a nearly full-scale prototype. So sort of the small-scale prototype. And that's now going through some iterations before they kind of go to the next stage, which is the very first big prototype. Now, after completing this stage is actually when they could actually get some decent funding from investors. But the very first stage got them the very, very first early pre-seed capital. All right, let's keep going. Success is walking from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. It's a good quote from Winston. It's absolutely true. One of the best things I've noticed in founders is being able to try lots of things, have lots of things fail, but just keep going because you're still enthusiastic. Mixture of optimism and realism at its best. Okay, we're now into the third section, which is proof. And I know I've sort of been going a bit fast, so apologies if someone's missed anything, but we'll get the recording. What I might do is do a question now. So I'll skip across. So let's have a look. Okay, so I'll pick off the first one. Do you think the experimentation route is apt for hardware? Is this a software services model? And we've had a reply as well. Frequent hardware experimentation get priced real quick. Yeah, so as I mentioned sort of before with the proof of concept prototype, when you've got physical hardware costs, right? So in any form, it becomes a little trickier because obviously you can't simply go online and just use free web tools. And so again, I think one of the things I would recommend you sort of investigate is what do you need to show? What do you need to show that works? What proof of concept do you need to show to be able to unlock that next stage for your company? Whether that's a grant, whether that's angel funding, or whether that's potentially a customer trial, right? So if you think about who your customers are and what do they need to see. And then once you have a sense about what that proof of concept looks like, that's when you can kind of look at, okay, so what money do we need to spend to develop that? Now, I've worked with medical devices before, for example, where a proof of concept might be actually the entire device they got to build. But in reality, actually, after we started speaking to people, one of the questions that came up from a lot of investors for this particular device was they were very concerned whether you could actually get the form factor that they wanted. And so for this device, it was something to look at inside the eye. So if you've ever been to a doctor, they'll look at the back of your eye. And the tools they use to look at the back of your eye are really old school, haven't changed for like a couple of decades. And that means they're missing out on a lot of information, right? And so in this sense, what he did is he actually made a very, very, very low fidelity prototype. We're talking like very low fidelity of just the mechanism which he would be using to look in the back of the eye. It wasn't a polished product. We actually used the 3D printer. And then we tucked together a whole bunch of things. And he just wanted to show that, yes, you could actually use this form factor to do this one particular functionality, right? It didn't have all the other bells and whistles, just one particular functionality. That was enough to convince some hospitals to give them write an expression of interest or sign one, and B, to get some angels interested in what they were doing, as well as to get a grant from government, right? And so that's kind of where they started. So again, it kind of depends on what you're building, but a lot of the trickiness in hardware businesses is just understanding what is that first proof of concept that we need to build, and how much is it going to cost, and then how do we reduce that cost so we can still demonstrate what we need to demonstrate as being a functional. So I hope that helps. All right. Now, we apparently have 5 minutes left. So, I'll go through proof, and then from that point, we're going to talk about Galileo, and we'll do a bit of a Q&A. So for those that can stick around for the full hour and have to leave, that's fine. And for others that can stay on, please stay on and feel free to continue to ask questions, and we'll try and get to all of them. So assumptions are for losers. And what I mean by that is every idea is a set of assumptions, but some are riskier than others, right? So one of the key things for you is to understand as a founder, what are your riskiest assumptions? And I like this image here because it's very obvious, you know, what is the riskiest assumption for this person who is diving off a cliff? Well, you know, if I was in a room, obviously you probably all shut out, but obviously the key assumption here is that there's enough depth at the bottom of where he's diving into. Now, that's also not a bad analogy here, because in this case, there obviously is, and they know this way beforehand, right? So they already know this. They already know that there's enough depth, and they already know that there are other risks they can control for. Understanding and proving your assumptions to be true or false is part of the proof that you need to have for a viable business, right? And so whether that's hardware, software, or whatever it is, you've got to sort of understand those assumptions, right? The obvious assumption that people kind of think about first is, will people pay? And that's why that's such a powerful assumption to prove to be true straight away, right? So if you've got a Kickstarter, if you've got prepayments or down payments, we'll talk about that in a second. But there's far more nuance to this, which is how and when people pay and want to use your product, right? And how much they'll pay. Innovation itself is inherently risky due to extreme uncertainty and unknowable outcomes. There's also a benefit. For example, the benefit of social media services is huge, but we didn't foresee some of the social anxiety issues that it would create either, right? And that's a good example of some things you just simply don't know until you do it. Controlling for what you can know is important, and this is all about risk reduction. You know, and that's more of an investment perspective, right? But it is also very true for founders, which is whatever you can know, you should know, because that reduces the unknowable, if that makes sense. It's probably a bit of a tongue twister there, but so these are kind of 5 areas where you can think about, and you can list out all your key assumptions in these 5 areas. Right? The first one is team, and this is pretty obvious, and this is the one I usually think about straight away, which is, do you care enough as a founder? Building businesses is tough. Are you going to have the optimism or the enthusiasm to go through the difficult stuff? Can you yourself recruit people on your mission? And does your team have the skills and resources, right? Or can you go out and get those skills and resources? Customers is sort of the next one. And this is, we touched on earlier with conversations, which is like, do they actually have the problem? What is the problem? Do they care enough to pay and use it? And can you find and acquire them at scale? Then you can talk about product. And by the way, there's no specific order for these areas. I just sort of put them down as typically what we get to when I'm helping early stage startups. Then we typically talk about product, right? So if you've got the team, you've got a passionate founder, you've got your first customer or your first group of customers, you think, and then you kind of go, okay, what do I need to build? Then the question is, can you build the first MVP, right? How do you build that? What does that very first version look like? Who do you have to go out and get money from to be able to build that? Or who can you convince to build it for you for free? And when will customers start paying? And that's an interesting one, because sometimes people are actually willing to pay quite early. And then you kind of got market, which is a broader venture capital sort of startup investor question, which is there enough demand? Is this market growing or is it stagnating? And will you become a market leader, or is it impossible for you to become a market leader, right? So what are those kind of dynamics there? And then thirdly, I put technology. In fact, product and technology are sometimes the same thing. But in this case, I think it's worth to separate out, because technology typically in the beginning is not what you envision it will be in the end, right? And what I mean by that is you start somewhere else. So can you create the technology that you want to create with a vision? Does the technology exist today in some form? And then the other question is, when will it be ready, right? If I think about this from a practical example of a startup, I'll use a company called Baraha. And Baraha is a LiDAR company. And so LiDAR is basically radar for autonomous vehicles. It sends out lots of lasers everywhere and allows the cars to see. So it's like giving cars eyes, right? There's actually a couple of different ways to do that. They created a whole new type of LiDAR. And so from a team perspective, they were the experts in this space because they already had domain expertise from doing this stuff in other areas. And so they kind of adapted a process and then put it into this auto industry. Then they went out and talked to customers and they realized that actually their solution was 10 times better, right? And so they were like, actually, we know customers are already paying for this. We know this is what they need, but in fact, they can't do the things that they want to do because the current solutions are nowhere near as good as our solution. And then actually the tricky part was building a proof of concept because LiDARs are very expensive things to build. So they had to build a really, really, really basic proof of concept. And then they took that proof of concept out and they went and started banging on the door of various investors, right? And that's actually how they raised their very first round. And from that point, it became a question of like, okay, how big is the market? And if we give you lots of money, can you actually build the technology that you need to build, right? And there's a lot of unknowns in there, and there's still a lot of challenges in that space. And that space is still unknown. There's no winners. There's a lot of different companies around the world in this space. But you could actually go through and kind of analyze each part of these assumptions that they had. Okay. I might keep on going and then we'll go, I'll finish this section and then I'll do a question and we'll go from there. Note it is 1:30, so for those of you who do have to head off, thanks very much for attending. And for those that you can stay on, please do. We'll send out the video of this as well so you'll be able to watch the rest and flick through the slides. But just to finish off the proof point section, these are some things to consider. If you're building a B2B business, often you start off as a consulting business. And so that's servicing initial customers switching on before switching on a scalable product. If you're building a B2C business, often that's starting off with large pre-orders or expressions of interests before you start investing in manufacturing. For life sciences and biotech, typically it starts off as an R&D question. So you're researching in a lab, and then the question becomes, how do you commercialize the underlying IP? Deep tech and med tech, it often starts with a patent. And so being able to get that patent in the very beginning is the first step before you can go out and talk to customers. And then sole traders, I won't touch on too much, but essentially sole traders, you're using your existing skills and just going out and selling yourself and your service you can do. So it's more about finding customers than it is about building technology. I will just touch on, so I'm going to leave you a few slides. So these slides you can look over later, but the ones I will talk about is understanding your customer acquisition costs and lifetime value. So if you haven't heard of those terms, have a flick through that later on. The one I will talk about is the one that I see a lot for startups, which is what you might call PTR, which is potential trial revenue. So this is when you go out and you talk to a customer, you go, we're building this thing. It's not ready yet, but we are. Would you like to have a trial with this service, right? And they go, yeah, absolutely. If you can build it, we'd love to have a trial. And so what you actually want to do is sign up people knowing the minimum price, right? So the price might scale, but they know the minimum is going to cost this on an annual basis, as an example. They're very interested in using this when it's ready, and that they've signed up to something, whether they're giving you details, whether they've signed an EOI form or something like that. They're still technically not a customer because they haven't given you any money and you haven't seen any revenue, but it acts as a baseline of interest, and it can be really helpful when you have investor conversations. The other question is sales funnel steps. So how many steps does it take for someone to give you money, right? And so on the right here, you can kind of see a very basic sales funnel. If you're not familiar with sales funnel, the quick introduction here is essentially you pour money to get customers at the very top of your funnel, right? So if you think about that as people that land on your website or your landing page, of those people, you call some of them expressed interest from there to there. And then finally, some of them actually follow up, and then you have and some of them convert. And then at the very end, only some of them will become sales, right? And so for some businesses, there's a lot of steps because they're very complicated products. So those are what we might call very complicated sales processes. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but you want to understand that going into it, or as much as possible. For some businesses, it's very easy. For e-commerce, for consumer businesses, it's typically, they come in, they see it, and they buy, right? But it is something to keep in mind if you haven't heard about them. I've given you a few metrics there. This is a really good post called 16 Startup Metrics, which is worth reading if you want to get a sense of other metrics that you can use to explain your business. Cool. So now we're going to talk about the Galileo perspective. And then July, I might promote you up to a panelist again, and you can sort of say a few words to finish off, and we'll do a bit of a Q&A. And I will go to an open question here. Thanks for some of you that have signed off. Bye, Ross. Do you think? We've talked about that one, so I'm gonna move. I'll talk about the second one, which is from Santiago. How do I attain user feedback on prototypes while not disclosing any IP? It can be hard to find a balance between showing everything to customer to have an in-depth feedback and protecting your data in the future if no IP protection is yet in place. Okay, so there's a couple of answers for that question, but let's just presume that I'll just presume you're thinking of patenting something, right? So in those situations, often what you need to understand is not so much then showing them the patentable prototype, but consider making some modifications of your prototype that you definitely won't be included in the patent. So it won't disclose what you're patenting. So I think the first question here is if you are making a patent, there is a period where you can't disclose what you're doing because they might void the patent. Get some advice from a patent attorney about how you can talk about it without disclosing it. There are ways you can do about it, and there are ways you can absolutely get them to prototype things and test things. At the very extreme, it's getting people to sign an NDA. That's very, depending on the industry you're in, that's sort of not very well accepted. Often it's a very tricky route and most people won't sign it. But presuming you won't get people to sign an NDA, then the question is, I'd probably just get some advice on what you can tell and what you can show them from a patent attorney. Sometimes in the past, what we've done is we've just modified it slightly. So we're showing them a different version that won't be patented. Or rather than talk about the product that we're prototyping, we talk more about what do they need to see before they can start giving us money, right? Or how do they currently solve this, or how much money do they spend, or can they put a down payment on this right now? So we'll kind of look at other strategies around before they can show up. And then finally, obviously, if you do need a patent, then submit the application, and then it's protected, and then it's much easier to talk about. So, for example, you got to, if you are patenting something, you've got to patent it before you kind of do a Kickstarter campaign, because that potentially can void the patent. But a good thing is just, again, talk to a patent attorney, get some advice. A lot of them will probably talk to you for free, at least initially. And plus, you might become a source of business for them because you might do the patent with them. So yeah, there you go. Okay, so Galileo perspective, and then Jalal, we'll get you back on. So the main thing for Galileo is we're a new seed fund and accelerator program. We're going to be launching this year. So we're just getting ready now to go out with some news, which is great. Given everything else that's going on, I'm pretty excited to get out there and actually start investing. We're kind of looking for a few things, and I'm going to keep it a bit broad here because we'll come up with some more information soon. But one of the big areas we're looking for is high potential emerging founders. And emerging founders to us is anyone that could be the next generation of entrepreneurs that build really big, impactful companies, right? For a lot of you, that's a lot of you on this webinar. But for some of you, you might be wondering, does that fit in? I think the most important is if you consider yourself a high potential founder, we'd love to chat to you. And all of you should, because I think, entrepreneurship is very much something that is accessible by everyone. I don't believe it's something for only, the super geniuses. The second point that we need to look for, this is not all people, but this is specifically for us, is sort of the ambition component, right? And really, we're looking for outsized ambition, right? Now, obviously, you do have to start somewhere, but that is a component that we are looking for. We want to see that the goal is to build a very big, impactful business. In the beginning, you don't start with a big, impactful business. You start with a very small, insignificant business. But we want to know that's your goal going into it, and we want to get a sense of that too. And then for the third part that we look for is a special insight. And so a special insight could be, this is a problem you experience yourself. It could be something that you've seen other people experience, or you could be an expert, right? So typically a lot of scientists and researchers we talk to are experts in the field, and we want to know a little bit more about that. And finally, if you're affiliated with an existing program like the Generator at Monash, then that's fantastic. We're going to be focusing on those things, but if you're not, that's also okay. You can still pitch to us. So I'll give you some details at the end, but we'll be presenting some more information about that in the next month. Okay, let's switch to wrap up. And Jalal, do you want to say a few words and then we'll do a Q&A?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd just like to thank you, James. Thanks so much for facilitating this webinar today. I was wondering if anyone has any questions about the Generator and what we provide, how we can help you. So if you have any questions, feel free to send them through. If anyone's like interested in at kind of an early stage of their startup, one of our programs that's really excellent for that stage is called the Validator. So that's, or it has historically been a 5-week program that essentially gets you from idea to launch. So a lot of these things that we've been talking about today are covered in that program. We're currently doing our first round of the Validator, but we do it 3 times a year. So applications for the second round will be coming up soon. So keep your eyes out for that. Haven't got any questions coming through.
Okay, cool. We've got a couple questions here, and if anyone wants to potentially ask their problem live, just raise your hand. So there should be an option to raise your hand, and we might switch to some live questions as well. Before some of you clock off, there's a couple of things. We'll send this out. I've got a blog. This is where I'll post up this presentation and recording later. So if you want to, you can check it out. It's jamesoutloud.com. And if you want to stay up to date with Galileo and when we're starting investing and when we're starting accepting pitches, please just use that URL there, galileo.ventures/register. And finally, I'm actually running a deep dive on startup investors. There's a link there if you are interested. I've had a few founders go through. It's not for all founders, but if you're kind of getting that stage when you're going to be ready to pitch to investors, it's not a bad presentation to go through. And that's mostly for industry, but it's also available for founders. And there's a special ticket there just for anyone that's on this presentation. So let's go to some questions. And if you want to chat with everyone, you can raise your hand and your attendees, and I'll actually promote you as a panelist and you can ask it live. Diana was there. Diana, I might get you to talk. So I'm going to allow you to talk and see if you want to, you can ask us a question. Cross. You're also on mute, by the way. Okay. So I'll go back to the open questions. And the first one that's got a couple of votes is, here's one for the Generator. Is the Generator going to run an accelerator program this year? And what's the timeline looking like?
Yes, we will be. It's looking like it's going to be more so in the second half of the year. So generally we start first week of July. So we're looking like we're on track for that. But the form that it takes will probably be more online than in the past. But yes, we are running one this year.
Cool. Okay, that's good to know. The next question I'll go up to is, does getting users mean getting revenue? Is it really important to make money in the beginning? When does Facebook and Google start to make money? Okay, so there's a few questions there. But it's a good question. So thanks, Adrian. So to answer your question, does getting users mean getting revenue? No, not necessarily. So if you have a look at the link I sent inside when I talk about startup metrics, there are different terminology for that. But getting signups and getting revenue are sometimes separate things. Sometimes they're the same because they're people putting money. Obviously, making money off customers, so making actual sales is the ideal situation. But when you're starting off, sometimes it's not appropriate to be taking money, or sometimes you're not able to because it's not ready. So getting users can be a good first step. Now, it obviously depends on the type of product. For consumer products, it could be mean letting people use it for free in the very beginning and then start charging later on. For products which is aimed at businesses, sometimes it's giving them a 3-month trial or 1-month trial for free. And then for products that are very advanced, let's say a medical device or something like that, it's much more about getting the funding to be able to build every single stage before you sell it to a big customer, because typically each customer might be spending lots of money, right? So what we call the average contract value is really, really, really high. And in that situation, the approach is a bit different. So that's that question. Do you mind? I've got a question about does Galileo invest in projects outside of Australia? Yes, it does. We will be. So it's just a question of approaching us when we're kind of launched. We're still looking for obviously ambitious startups and ambitious founders. And ideally, we're looking for people that have made a little bit more progress than simply just at an idea stage. So something to keep in mind.
I think the next one is about the validator.
Yeah, go for it.
That's great that you're in the first cohort of 2020. And yes, it is going to be run online. A large part of this is that we are in the process of pivoting and running pilot programs. So our team has been working really hard on redesigning the validator to suit an online format. We're hoping it's just as valuable, if not more so. But we really, really want to base what we do for the rest of the year on your feedback. So the more feedback you can give to us, the better. And we're just going to keep developing from that. So yeah, excited to see what you're working on.
Great. Thanks, Jalal. Thanks very much. All right, let's go to another question. I note apparently my Bitly link isn't working. Apologies, I will send through that link in the follow-up email if you want to join the Deep Dive on Startup Investors Masterclass. So we'll send through that. It's probably just didn't configure properly when I was rushing to put it in the slides. Does Galileo take equity, and at what valuation for successful applications? That's a really good question, Delaware. So yes, so Galileo is looking to invest. Essentially, once you've been through the Monash generator, that's kind of when you're a good stage for us. So we're looking to invest up to $200,000. And we will be taking equity. So it will be an equity investment. It won't be a safe note. But I will let our announcement do the talking when we have finalized those details. And we'll be running a seed sort of program, which is essentially an extended accelerator. So it's going to be a 6-month program, but it's kind of like for startups at that next stage. So if you like, sometimes people call that scale ups. I think that's probably a bit of a misnomer because you're not really scaling up at that point, but people that essentially already started and they're looking to kind of take it to the next level and hire their first team and everything like that. Cool. Any other particular questions? I think for, sorry for pronouncing your name wrong, Vilva, how long does it take for a startup to show progress? Look, that really just depends. It can take a long time for some startups. It can take very quickly for others. The important thing is you are able to try lots of different stuff with some of the techniques we talked about beforehand to get that early traction. Remember, talking to customers is something you can do right now, right? And so I think for all startups, you should have a really good sense that your customers have a big problem in the first month of you going after your business, right? That's something you can do. It's free. And it just takes away a big assumption you're making, which is, you know, do people care and will anyone actually want to use what I'm trying to get out into the world? Okay, any other questions?
There's just one more from Anonymous. what's the difference between validator and accelerator? So there's a few differences. The validator is 5-week program, and we accept, I think we've accepted up to like 75 startups before in the cohort, and essentially that program is from going from idea to launch. The accelerator is 12 to 14 weeks long. You get $10,000 seed funding. We don't take any equity, and it is a 3 to 4 month program. And we accept 8 to 12 startups once a year. So it is a little bit more competitive, and we are looking for people that have more of that traction that we can see. But yeah, it's an excellent program. So if you're working on something, check out our website and see if the program would be right for you. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Any other final questions before we clock off? Okay, there's one question here that I will answer, which is I'd like to ask about competitor market research. At what stage do you do this? And the question disappeared off my screen. There it is. At what stage do you do this? And what are the key questions to ask? Anonymous attendee, I would say a couple of things about that. As a founder, I think as part of your research, when you're talking to customers, you want to get a good sense as to whether what you're doing is solved. So there's already tools out there on the market that allow them to do what they're doing, aka you're kind of a bit late to the game. So I think from that perspective, you want to get a sense of what is your competition. For those of you that is obviously something that doesn't exist, you do have to keep in mind that almost all ideas have been tried in some way. And if it's unclear that any of your customers have found a way to solve this problem, I'll probably take a bet there's maybe 3 to 4 companies in San Francisco right now that are trying to do what you're trying to do, right? And so from that perspective, it's good to know that, because when you do, and we are ready to talk to investors, one of the big questions is, okay, tell us about the competition landscape, right? And so it's really just a question again of like, if you kind of think of it from a market perspective, which is who else is out there, what are they doing, and are they taking the customers that we're taking as well? So they're going after the exact same people. When you're pitching a startup, sometimes it's good to know that. From my perspective, I'm not too fussed about whether there are competitors. I'm sure there are competitors. I'd like the founders to know about that. I'd like to know why they're different. But one of the things I do care about is, what is your particular unfair advantage, right? And what I mean by that is your startup, what's your unfair advantage that no one else has? It doesn't matter if they're doing your same product. It doesn't matter if they're in the same industry, but they simply do not have the advantage that you have, right? And so sometimes we call that, from a business theory perspective, that's competitive advantage or strategic competitive advantage. But really, it's just what makes you unfair. And at the very beginning, sometimes it's to do with the founders themselves, their backgrounds, their insights. They're the inventor, or something about the market that very few other people know about, right? And so just have a think a bit more about what makes you unfair. You don't have to dwell too much on the competition in that regard. And that's an important question at the very beginning. What is your LinkedIn URL? You can find me on LinkedIn. Just Google me, you'll be fine. And I think we've answered all those other questions in some form. So I might leave it there. We've got one more question that's come in, and then I'll answer this one that's come in, and then I'll probably leave it there as well. So you have a business idea which involves mediating between a range of businesses and customers. How do you poll the businesses / individuals? I think I'll broaden that question out. So typically what I see a lot of the time when you do go out there and talk to customers is that it becomes really unclear who you should go after first. And so what I mean by that is you'll get a lot of positive responses from a lot of different types of people. And so one of the things I'd recommend you do is you kind of need to map out your customer segments. So if you start to group your customers into different segments, and if you think about it from a business model canvas or lean canvas, there's that section which is customer segments. You need to be able to define those segments. You know, sometimes it's a bit tricky to define those segments, but other times it can be quite obvious. Let's say you're selling to HR managers, right? Let's say you're making a new type of mental health application, and you are selling this mental health application to big businesses, right? Now, if you go out and do customer interviews, you'll probably find that individuals would be interested and would pay money. You'll probably find that small businesses would be interested to pay money, and you'll probably find that all sorts of large businesses will pay money. You probably want to start grouping your customers by how many people they manage, right? That's actually not a bad segment. So are they an HR manager of a company with more than 10,000 employees, right? And people go, that's a lot of people. I know of some HR managers that have more than 10,000 employees, right? Now they have very, very specific, very deep problems. And the money that they can spend to solve those problems is astronomical, right? Do they have managers, employees of less than 1,000 people, right? And then you can go to 500, 10, 20, you know, down to the sole individual, right? And so that's one way you could segment it, you know? And then I can guarantee you each of those segments will have very different problems related to mental health in their workforce, right? And so when you do customer segments, a key question you've got to ask yourself is, what customer segment are we going to go after first? Because that defines your business. And what customer segment do I really want to go tackle, right? So which one am I passionate about and why? And so that's, again, a slightly more long answer there. But what I am trying to say is you want to work out where your segments are, and then you need to prioritize and choose one. And I like to choose the one that has the most pain. So the one that really, really, really needs your solution. They tend to be the great ones to go after first. And sometimes it's very different to who you think you're originally going to sell your business, your service to. That's a good thing, by the way. So something to keep in mind. Cool. I'm going to leave it there. Jalal, any final words you wanted to say?
Not really, just, big thank you. And everyone who's been on the webinar today will hear from me via email. We'll send you all the links that we spoke about today. That's it.
Great. Thanks, guys. I've put some further resources in here for startups, and my contact details are there. If you want to send me an email, feel free to, and happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, keep a lookout for the links coming to your inbox. Thanks very much for being with us, and hope you enjoyed it and got some information. And thanks, Charlotte, for organizing.
Pleasure.
Thanks, guys. See you later.